Welcome to Starbound. My name's Luca, and I'll be your narrator. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories and want to support us, we're on Patreon now. You'll also get access to exclusive stories you won't hear anywhere else. Link is in the description, now let's get into it. The galvanized steel screws bit into the dense, pressure-treated plywood, spitting a high-pitched mechanical whine. Benton leaned his entire body weight against the heavy DeWalt power drill. The fierce vibration traveled up his forearms and settled deep into his shoulders. A faded grey sweater insulated him beneath a high-visibility yellow rain jacket. The fabric shone, slick with the pervasive greasy humidity preceding a major Gulf squall. He released the trigger. The drill whirred down to silence, leaving the afternoon air thick and stagnant. Benton stepped back from the community center's massive plate glass window, wiping a smear of sweat and sawdust from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. The community center sat on a slight rise 6 blocks inland from the coastline, a designated primary shelter for holdouts who defied the mandatory evacuation orders. The sky above the bruised horizon formed a solid, advancing wall of crushed charcoal. The wind intensified, carrying a resonant thrum that rattled the overhead power lines and signaled a plummeting barometric pressure. He reached into his rain jacket's deep pocket and pulled out a heavy mechanical compass. The brass casing pressed cold into his palm. He checked his bearing against the street grid, then glanced at the treetops and the swaying power lines. The gusts now drove steadily out of the northeast, matching the National Weather Service models. He pocketed the compass and unclipped the ruggedized weather radio from his belt. The digital display showed a localized pressure of 958 millibars, dropping fast. Benton kept his breathing even. He worked through the checklist, driven by a stubborn commitment to the coastal city's residents. An 80-year-old memory pushed him forward. A catastrophic levee failure in a neighboring parish, a town swallowed before extraction, a night of dark water and desperate radio calls fading into static. The memory fueled his current, relentless pace. He picked up another heavy sheet of plywood, aligning it over the final exposed pane of glass. He raised the drill. The ambient light shifted. Benton lowered the tool. The low-hanging overcast layer flared from above, flashing with a stuttering rhythmic burn entirely distinct from terrestrial lightning. He stepped away from the wall and squinted upward, shielding his eyes against the erratic glare. A dozen brilliant streaks tore through the dark clouds. They held mathematically exact chevron patterns, structured differently than the stumbling scatter of space debris. The first wave speared toward the city's primary telecommunications hub and electrical substations. Behind them, larger objects burned with a blistering cyan glare, trailing superheated gas as they descended beyond downtown toward the eastern marshlands. The air pressure spiked, popping Benton's ears. A series of low, concussive thuds vibrated through the concrete sidewalk and up through his boot soles. He stared at the sky. The geometric, dark metal drop pods breached the cloud deck, shedding their thermal entry sheaths as they fired downward-facing retro thrusters. Benton unclipped his radio transmitter. "Tess, you seeing this?"
"I'm seeing it,"
the radio crackled back, the signal layered with static.
"And that definitely isn't the Federal Emergency Management Agency."
High above the blue and green planet holding a powered station keeping orbit over the Gulf coastline, Soris stood upon her flagship's sterile command deck. She belonged to the highest military echelon of her species. Her physical form presented an imposing architecture of ochre-scaled, interlocking dermal plating layering over dense musculature. Pale blue thermal ridges tracked along her skull and down her articulated spine. These external organs required arid, strictly controlled atmospheric conditions to function. The life support systems maintained the deck at a constant 11% humidity, scrubbing particulate matter and neutralizing thermal variance. Soris clasped her talons behind her back. She studied the high-definition light table rendering dominating the deck center. The display mapped the targeted human population center in glowing wireframe geometry. "Status on the Vanguard's deployment," Soris commanded. Her vocalizations emerged as clipped, absolute statements translated instantly by the ship's internal systems into a low, resonant frequency. She enforced rigid tactical doctrine, demanding absolute certainty and immediate action from her subordinates. Nemeth, her primary sensor adjutant, stood at a secondary console, slightly below the elevator command dais. He possessed a smaller frame, his ochre plating thinner, his posture curled over the tactile interfaces required for data analysis. The delicate sensory barbells near his jawline vibrated, overstimulated by the torrent of data streams pouring in from the descending drop pods. "Deployment vectors are absolute. Fleet Sub-Commander," Nemeth reported. his claws tapping at a staccato rhythm across the tactile feedback interface. The Vanguard bypassed the orbital debris fields. Targeted strikes on the copper wire communications infrastructure are commencing. The dense human population centers rely entirely on exposed electronic networks. Severing those hubs guarantees swift capitulation. Soris narrowed her primary ocular clusters, assessing the holographic map. I note a massive swirling atmospheric disturbance adjacent to the designated landing zone. The kinetic energy readings surpass standard atmospheric shifts. Nemeth magnified the projection section. A spiraling mass of vapor and pressure gradients bloomed over the landing coordinates. He adjusted his optical filters, clearing the swirling colors with a sharp clack of his jaw. It is a regional atmospheric anomaly, Commander, Nemeth stated. Standard planetary weather. Our infantry and mechanized units carry grade 5 impact shielding and localized thermal regulators. The native species routinely halts productive activity during these events. They seek shelter, giving us the opportunity to advance with full advantage. Soris processed the logic. The Imperial military doctrine dictated that native environmental factors proved inconsequential to advanced technological force. Proceed with the ground assault. Sever their communications. We will force their leadership to surrender before this planetary rotation concludes. She straightened her spine, her thermal ridges tracking the cool filtered air. The Imperial meritocracy rewarded absolute dominance. The native species below relied on soft, unarmored biology tethered to a chaotic biosphere. They would break and run before the Vanguard's organized march. Tess kicked the makeshift command post's heavy fire door wide open. The metal crashed against the cinder block wall. Ignoring the noise, she marched into the small fluorescent-lit room, clutching a heavily stained coffee mug in her left hand, and a rubber-encased radar tablet in her right. The rising humidity frizzed her dark hair, plastering damp ringlets to her forehead. She wore a heavy flannel shirt over a faded meteorological department t-shirt. As the regional broadcast center's lead weather tracker, she analyzed radar loops with an unbroken, rigid stare, calculating wind vectors while her coffee grew cold. Benton sat behind a folding plastic table at the room's center. A broad topographical map detailing the city and surrounding coastal marshlands covered the surface, weighed down at the corners by heavy flashlights and spare radio batteries. The alien landing pod struck the earth, sending concussive thuds echoing through the concrete walls and rattling the loose ceiling tiles. Speaking over the extraterrestrial invasion's noise, Tess slammed the heavy tablet onto the surface directly over the city map's center. You need to look at this, Tess demanded, tapping a chipped fingernail against the screen's reinforced glass. Benton leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table to examine the tablet. The screen displayed a massive swirling mass of deep purples, dark reds, and stark whites. The radar loop showed the system churning directly toward their coordinates. The Hook Echo is forming off the Southern Barrier Islands, Tess said, rattling off the data. She took a sip of lukewarm coffee and grimaced. The barometric pressure is plummeting 5 millibars an hour. Sustained winds will cross 140 miles per hour. The storm surge will push 15 feet of seawater straight up the primary drainage canals. Benton studied the tightly packed isobars on the screen. When does the eye wall hit the mainland? The outer bands are already overhead, Tess said, pointing to the window. The primary squall line will hit the city's limits in less than 35 minutes. It's outrunning the models. Another heavy shockwave rattled the building. Dust drifted down from the acoustic ceiling tiles. And the visitors? Benton asked, maintaining his deliberate cadence. He approached the aliens as just another severe environmental hazard, treating the formalized threat assessments as secondary. They dropped into the eastern marshlands, Tess replied, tapping a secondary screen displaying raw seismic data and localized thermal blooms. Radar reads a heavy mechanized Vanguard. They sit roughly 9 miles out from the downtown corridor. Marching straight down Highway 92 puts them in the city center in an hour. Benton looked from the alien landing coordinates to the incoming cyclone's massive purple swirl. He checked the distance against the wind speeds. They'll miss that timeline, Benton murmured. Tess took another sip of coffee. Why? Because, Benton said, tapping the purple Hook Echo on the radar. They landed in the low ground. The sky is about to drop the ocean on their heads. We need to secure the secondary storm doors. The Imperial Vanguard touched down in the dense marshlands bordering the city's eastern edge. The landing zones formed a mess of shattered cypress trees, smoking craters and boiling displaced water. Fleet Subcommander Soris's tactical doctrine demanded a rapid mechanized advance to secure the perimeter. The heavy Imperial armor deployed from the drop pods' scorched holds. The Class 9 lift tank showcased the Empire's engineering. Above their homeworld's sterile rocky canyons or the frozen, solid methane plains of previous conquests, the vehicles hovered over the terrain. They generated a localized gravitational displacement field that pushed against a planetary crust's solid mass, allowing the heavy armor to glide over rough landscapes. The left tank drifted down the drop pod's deployment ramp, clearing the metal grating and moving out over the soil. The ground beneath the levitation field consisted of deep mud, decaying organic matter, and loose silt, heavily saturated by the rising storm tide. The displacement drive engaged. The lift engines whined, seeking a solid physical mass to push against. The downward thrust wave struck the waterlogged mud. The immense downward pressure shoved aside the liquid and the loose silt, carving a massive crater directly beneath the tank. The hover mechanism demanded solid ground for lift. Encountering liquid mud, it ground it out completely. The heavily armored tank sank, groaning under its own weight. The ochre-colored armor plating slipped deep into the thick, black mud. The vehicle settled onto its chassis, burying its primary directional thrusters in 5 feet of suctioning mud. Inside the vehicle, the pilot adjusted the power output, pushing the lift engines to the red line. The engines hit a deafening pitch. The mud bubbled and churned, baking into a brittle ceramic shell beneath the thrusters while the chassis locked firmly in place. Behind the lead transport, 3 more tanks rolled off the ramps and sank into the wetland's deep mud. Aboard the flagship, Nemeth leaned closer to his telemetry screens, running the density scans 4 times. His jaw clicked. "Commander Soris, the mechanized advance has stalled. The planetary crust in the landing zone fails the structural density requirements for gravitational displacement." Soris narrowed her eyes. "Dirt immobilizes them. A saturated combination of soil and liquid H2O, Nemeth said, gripping the edge of his console. "The terrain-specific gravity fluctuates." "Leave the heavy armor," Soris ordered. "Deploy the infantry detachments. They will advance on foot, engage their thermal regulators and cohesion boots. We will claim the zone man by man." The Imperial infantry detachments marched forwards, abandoning their sunken vehicles in the steaming swamp. They moved in the interlocking squad patterns, their sleek armor shedding the ambient moisture. They carried the standard-issue ion rifles, weapons designed to vaporize biological matter and melt through dense metallic armor with superheated packets of ionized gas. They reached the elevated asphalt ribbon of Highway 92. The air hung thick, an oppressive humidity that coated the lungs with every breath. The temperature hovered near 89 degrees at 98% relative humidity. A quarter-mile down the highway, a hastily constructed roadblock blocked the intersection. 6 local sheriff's deputies crouched behind their cruisers' steel doors, aiming pump-action shotguns and hunting carbines. They gripped their weapons with white knuckles and stayed planted. The blue and red strobe lights cutting through the gloom. The squad leader identified the native biologicals. He raised his ion rifle, aimed squarely at the cruiser's center, and squeezed the firing mechanism. The magnetic containment field in the rifle's barrel collapsed, accelerating a packet of superheated ionized gas from the muzzle at high velocity. The weapon's payload, burning at 9,000 degrees Celsius, slammed directly into the dense wall of suspended water droplets, choking the space between the soldier and the deputies. The interaction triggered a thermodynamic flash. The projectile's heat transferred into the suspended water along the shot's trajectory. The droplets flashed from liquid to vapor in a microsecond, expanding into a localized explosion of immense concussive force. The blast detonated less than 9 feet ahead of the squad leader, falling short of the cruisers and tearing the ambient moisture into a blinding shockwave of superheated gas. The thermal bloom washed backward over the advancing soldiers. Their armor systems, built to dissipate focused laser fire and kinetic impacts, let the permeating cloud of boiling vapor flow straight through their structural gaps. The pressurized vapor rushed into the frontline soldiers' respiratory vents and external thermal ridges. The troops unleashed a piercing, erratic clatter. They dropped their weapons, collapsing to the wet asphalt and clutching their scalded sensory organs. Down the road, the deputies lowered their rifles after the bang, exchanging glances as the invaders detonated their own weapons. The squad leader, his dermal plating blistered and his respiratory system seizing, stared at his ion rifle. He gripped the weapon that had secured a dozen worlds, his tactical training failing to provide context for an atmosphere that turned his own fire against him. The storm officially made landfall. It hit the coastline as a kinetic wall. A sky-tearing roar consumed the region, swallowing the hum of generators, the crack of gunfire, and the shouts of men. The sky opened, dumping a blinding sheet of torrential rain. The wind tore through the streets, ripping heavy commercial signs from their steel moorings and snapping thick pine trees into splinters. Aboard the flagship in orbit, the commanding deck maintained its dry, sterile hum. At the secondary station, Nemet's telemetry console flashed with scrolling error codes. Nemet recalibrated his primary sensors, his claws slipping across the tactile interface as data streams from the ground units corrupted in real time. "Commander," Nemet said, his sensory barbells vibrating to a rigid blur. "Cohesive telemetry on the Vanguard failed. The planetary atmosphere's acoustic noise overloads their auditory receptors. The ambient thermal exchange creates massive scattering in our infrared tracking." Soris marched down from her dais, peering over his shoulder at the flickering displays. "Filter the atmospheric interface. Isolate the target signatures." "The filters read the interference as solid matter, Commander," Nemet said, dropping his formal cadence. "The thermodynamic payload of this localized event shatters every tactical model we possess." He pulled up the rotating storm cell's chemical analysis sitting directly on top of their ground forces, checking the fluctuating composition readouts, and routing the numbers through the primary translation database. He ran them again, testing for a hardware failure. The results matched exactly. His jaw clattered. He looked up at Soris, the blue hue in his thermal ridges bleeding out to a pale grey. He pointed a trembling talon at the telemetry screen. The display mapped a volume of H2O dumping onto the battlefield that overwhelmed their fluid dynamics models. "Water," Nemet whispered, the word carrying across the quiet command center. Soris stared at the readouts. She understood precipitation from the biological surveys. The scale of this event shattered her military logic. The liquid's raw mass, the wind's kinetic force, the plunging atmospheric pressure. A fluid system dismantled her Vanguard unit by unit. "Hold the advance," Soris commanded, locking her posture into rigid authority. "Instruct the ground forces to seek structural cover. We will resume the assault when the anomaly dissipates." "Commander," Nemet murmured, tracking the massive, slow-moving radar loop. "The anomaly spans hundreds of miles. The system will persist over the target through most of the current planetary night." Inside the community center, rain hammered against the plywood-covered windows in a continuous roar. Benton stood in the main hallway, illuminated by the battery-powered emergency light's harsh glare. The building groaned under the wind's strain. 6 local sheriff's deputies stood in front of him, water pooling at their boots as they shivered. They had retreated from the roadblock when the storm surge pushed knee-deep water up the highway. "The rain washes out the thermal optics," a young deputy named Dawson shouted over the wind's howl. He held up a Scopes tactical rifle requisitioned from the armory. "The landscape matches the water's temperature. The lens shows a solid wall of gray static." Benton nodded. The ambient rain equalized the thermal landscape. The invaders' optics faced the same washout. Benton shifted his focus. Floodwaters swallowed the evacuation routes, and the sky dropped a torrent. He shifted from managing a disaster to mounting a defense inside the cyclone. He needed to turn the environment against the hostiles. "Ditch the battery-powered optics," Benton ordered, pitching his voice to cut through the room's tension. "Put the scopes and thermal sights away. They're dead weight in this rain." Dawson looked at his tactical rifle. "Put it away? How do we acquire targets?" "We wait until they enter visual range," Benton replied. He pointed toward a stack of heavy plastic bins piled near the gymnasium's entrance. "Open those." The deputies unlatched the bins. Inside sat stacks of thick rubber ponchos and a dozen iron-sighted hunting rifles. Local hunters had donated the battered mechanical weapons to the emergency shelter years ago. "These weapons operate on strict mechanics," Benton explained, pulling a rubber poncho over his head. The thick material smelled of industrial latex. "They ignore thermal bloom. They fire just as well covered in mud as they do in a dry room. We fight with tools built for the wet." He grabbed a lever-action rifle. He racked the lever, sending a solid ch-ch of engaging metal through the room. The mechanism locked with heavy terrestrial certainty. "The invaders require perfect conditions," Benton said, looking at the officers. "We adapt. Suit up. We use the weather." Aboard the flagship, Soris gripped the railing until her talons scraped the metal. Her ground advance struck a wall. Her troops huddled in flooded ditches and abandoned gas stations. Their weapons short-circuiting while the wind-driven deluge overloaded their armor's thermal regulators. "Since the ground rejects our vehicles," Soris commanded, turning her attention to the tactical flight coordinator, "we will secure the objective from the sky, deploy the close air support squadrons, target the human barricades, clear a path for the infantry." "Compliance, Commander," the flight coordinator replied. From the flagship's secondary hangar bays, a squadron of 4 aerodynamic interceptors dropped out of orbit. They showcased razor-sharp edges and polished ochre armor, built for rapid strafing runs. They utilized immense thrust and agile maneuvering fins to dart through battlefields. The interceptors plummeted through the upper atmosphere, their hulls glowing with entry heat. They punched through the cyclone's upper cloud bands. The atmosphere inside a massive cyclone functions as a churning engine of vertical shear. As the interceptors dove beneath the cloud cover to level out and strafe the human positions, they flew directly into a microburst. A localized column of sinking air within the storm drove downward like an atmospheric hammer. The wind shear's downward force slammed into the vessel's wide control surfaces. The flight computers, programmed to handle lateral turbulence, overloaded, attempting to process a vertical wind vector dropping at 135 miles per hour. The lead interceptor angled its thrusters upward to compensate. The gale caught the wide wings, flipping the craft onto its back. The delicate maneuvering fin snapped under the aerodynamic stress. The gale batted the craft into a decaying spin. It tumbled toward the Earth, surrendered to the sky's fluid dynamics. Soris watched the telemetry screens on the command deck. The orderly icons representing her air support squadron spiraled out of control, their altitude numbers dropping exponentially. Ship by ship, the icons vanished. The vessels crashed into the deep marshland miles away from the city. Their hulls shattered against the cypress trunks, their fuel cells detonating in muffled underwater explosions. The storm swatted them from the air. Soris gripped her dais railing, her talons digging deep into the polished metal. She squared her shoulders, her jaw clamping shut. What destroyed them? Identify the terrestrial defense batteries! Sensors recorded absolute silence from the defensive batteries commander. Nemeth whispered, staring at his screens with wide, unblinking optics. The weather destroyed them. Benton pushed his way through the community center security doors, stepping into the enclosed records room. Metal-filling cabinets lined the small space. The cinder block construction muffled the storm's roar down to a heavy, vibrating hum. Tess sat on a folding chair in the corner, turning the crank on an emergency radio to charge the receiver. The dim yellow light of a battery-powered lantern illuminated her face. Benton exhaled a long breath. He unzipped his wet rain jacket and dropped it to the linoleum floor. He rolled his shoulders, loosening the stiff muscles, and sat on a plastic stool opposite her. Tess released the crank. She lifted a battered stainless steel thermos from beside her chair, poured a steaming cup of black coffee into the plastic lid, and handed it across the gap. He took it with both hands, letting the lid's warmth seep into his cold palms. He drank the bitter, dark roast. The heavy metal doors sealed them away from the wind and the invasion, offering a brief sanctuary. "You look rough," Tess noted, wiping a smudge of dirt off her own cheek. "I've had better days," Benton admitted, staring into the dark liquid. "How are the pressure readings?" "Holding steady," Tess said, leaning back against the filing cabinet. "The eye wall will sit directly over the city for the next few hours. We settle in for a long night." She rubbed the back of her neck. "I tracked down the telemetry of those drop pods before the grid went down." "And?" "The pods run advanced thermal shielding for re-entry," Tess said, letting a dry chuckle escape. "But their deployed armor left the lower chassis gaskets vulnerable to deep water immersion. Our visitors skipped the flood zone maps." Benton let out a short bark of laughter. The sound broke the tight grip on his lungs that had held since the first pod breached the clouds. Tess chuckled with him, the sound echoing in the small room. He passed the thermos back to her. She took a sip, leaving a coffee ring on the plastic lid before handing it back. The bitter coffee steadied his hands, resetting his focus for the night's next phase. Griggs navigated his custom-built recovery rig through the primary intersection's rising floodwaters. The tow tucked utilized a massive diesel-burning engine that chugged with a deep torque. The heavy mud tires, as tall as a man, chewed through the debris-filled water. Griggs stayed behind every hurricane season. He carried a wide frame with broad shoulders and thick forearms smeared in dark grease. He wore canvas coveralls and an oil-stained baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He treated the extraterrestrial invasion as a severe disruption to his towing schedule. The water in the intersection rose fast as the storm surge backed up the drainage canals. The staccato crack of ion fire echoed down the avenue, illuminating the rain in harsh flashes of blue. Griggs tuned out the gunfire. He shifted the heavy manual transmission into neutral, setting the air brakes with a loud hiss. He opened the door and stepped out onto the running board, letting the rain soak his coveralls. He pulled a heavy pair of leatherwork gloves from his pocket. He reached behind the truck's cab and grabbed the primary winch's thick braided cable. 5 abandoned city transport buses sat parked along the intersection's elevated shoulder. Griggs waded waist-deep into the surging floodwaters. He ducked under the first bus's front bumper and locked the hook onto the solid steel crossmember. He splashed back to the truck, climbed into the cab, and engaged the power takeoff. The hydraulic winch whined, taking up the slack. The braided cable snapped taut. Griggs muttered over the steering wheel. "Come on, big girl. Time to move." He feathered the clutch. The diesel engine roared, black exhaust spewing from the vertical smokestacks. The tow truck strained, the tires gripping the submerged asphalt. Inch by inch, the city bus groaned and shifted. The tires dragged laterally across the pavement. Griggs maneuvered the truck, dragging the bus in a wide arc until it lay horizontally across the primary intersection, forming a blockade. He unhooked the cable, waded over to the second bus, and hooked the frame. He dragged the second vehicle, aligning it nose to tail with the first. He grabbed the third bus and pulled it to close the gap, constructing a continuous wall of heavy steel across the road. The floodwater's path immediately changed. The storm runoff hit the crude levee Griggs had constructed. The water backed up, surging against the buses, and redirected forcefully down the elevated commercial corridor. The avenue offered the final approach vector for the advancing infantry. Griggs sat in the cab of his truck, wiping the rain from his face with a greasy rag. The water level on the corridor rose, forming a fast-moving artificial river. He reached for the CB radio on his dashboard. He pressed the transmit button. "Benton, Griggs here. I finished the plumbing. The runoff rushes down the main street. What's the next play?" Fleet Subcommander Soros, monitoring the telemetry, saw the rising urban flooding mire her infantry. The currents slowed their advance, exposing them to kinetic fire from the human defenders. She activated her command override. "Deploy the cohesion fields. Execute surface traverse protocols." The Imperial infantry boots featured localized cohesion emitters. The devices locked onto the existing surface tension at the waterline and reinforced it beneath each sole, creating a momentary rigid skin strong enough to bear their weight. That mechanism allowed the soldiers to step up and skim across the standing water. The heavy infantry activated their boots. The liquids beneath their feet hardened. They stepped up from the muck and balanced on the rushing muddy floodwaters. They initiated a gliding advance down the main avenue, skimming over the currents directly toward the community center. Their sleek armor deflected the heavy rain as they closed the distance. From the community center's second-story window, Benton watched through a pair of brass binoculars. The invaders rose from the flood, gliding over Griggs's artificial river. Benton lowered the binoculars. He traced their movement across the ripples. They stayed anchored to the surface tension. He keyed his radio, mapping out the chemistry. "Griggs," Benton said. "The hostiles project a field to walk on the water's top layer." They glide straight down the avenue. "I see 'em," Griggs answered on the radio. "Strutting right over the current." "That ends now," Benton said. "You parked next to the industrial supply depot on the corner of 4th and Main." "That's right. The brick building with the roll-up doors." "Break down those doors," Benton ordered. Inside sit pallets of commercial-grade chemical degreaser and concentrated industrial soap for the road equipment. Breach those barrels and dump every gallon directly into the flood water. A low chuckle rumbled over the radio. "You want me to give them a bath, Benton?" "I want you to change the water's chemistry," Benton replied. "Break the surface tension. Do it now." Griggs slammed the tow truck into gear and drove through the supply depot's roll-up doors, buckling the metal tracks. He jumped from the cab, grabbed a heavy fire axe from his toolkit, and smashed open the 50-gallon plastic drums of neon green industrial degreaser and vicious soap. He kicked the drums onto their sides. Hundreds of gallons of thick surfactant spilled across the concrete floor, flowing out the shattered doors and dumping directly into the corridor's muddy floodwaters. The chemical mixture washed down the avenue, carried by the fast-moving current. The neon green degreaser and thick soap merged with the main body of water, severing the hydrogen bonds holding the water molecules together. The concentrated surfactant spread across the floodwater, aggressively eliminating the surface tension that provided resistance against solid objects. The Imperial heavy infantry advanced in a tight phalanx, their cohesion boots gliding over the floods. They crossed the final block toward the community center. The slick's leading edge reached their boots. The localized fields found no surface tension to grip. The liquid beneath them shifted from a supportive floor into a frothing pool. The squad leader's striding pace hit the degreaser. He slid backward, shooting entirely out of control and slamming into the current. His thick plating dragged him straight beneath the churning foamy waves. The soldiers behind him hit the slick and dropped. The heavily armored infantry thrashed in the water, their weapons firing into the sky as they fell. The vicious soap coated their armor, rendering the plating slick. Their gauntlets slipped off each other's shoulders. They failed to grip the submerged asphalt. The weight of their combat gear, designed for solid ground, acted as a lethal anchor. The phalanx broke apart. The soldiers sank beneath the floodwaters, swallowing the thick chemical foam as the industrial soap nullified their traverse tech. The street emptied, leaving only neon green bubbles swirling in the current. Aboard the flagship, Sub-Commander Soris watched her heavy infantry icons extinguish from the holographic map. The water swallowed her primary assault force. She slammed a fist onto her command console, cracking the glass interface. The engagement had slipped from her hands. "Nemet!" Soris roared, her shoulders bunching tight against her neck. "Establish direct optical communications with the surviving squad leaders. Route a grass visual feed to my console. I will direct them manually." Nemet keyed the high-powered optical laser communication array. The engineers had built the system to punch through atmospheric interference using a focused tight beam transmission. He aimed the laser array toward the surviving command nodes scattered across the city's higher elevations, and triggered the beam. The intense rain, combined with the thick sea fog rolling in behind the eye wall, packed the atmosphere with suspended moisture. Massive Mii scattering occurred as the microscopic water droplets acted as billions of tiny prisms. The atmospheric particulate wildly diffracted the high-energy transmission. The concentrated data scattered in every direction, bleeding its energy into the clouds. On the ground, the survivors looked up as the dark storm clouds absorbed the signal, producing only a diffuse halo of blue light. Nemet stared at his console. The data returned flatlined. The weather absorbed the transmission. "The optical link breaks apart," Nemet reported, gripping his console edge. "The atmospheric moisture scatters the photons. The signal degrades into ambient light. The connection drops." Soris gripped her station. She commanded a fleet armed to incinerate a continent, yet the cloud cover stripped her optics bare. The storm severed her from the vanguard. She floated in a metal box above a chaotic world that rejected her invasion logic. On the ground, Benton noted the shift in momentum. The storm isolated the remaining hostiles. He led Tess, the remaining deputies, and a few armed civilians to the community center's loading dock. Deep water lapped against the concrete edge. 6 flat-bottomed metal swamp boats sat tied to the cleats. The long, wide hulls bore a matte olive green paint. Heavy-duty electric trolling motors rested on the transoms. The hostiles retreated to the high ground, speaking over the driving rain as water pooled on his brim hat. They huddle around the elevated highway overpasses and the golf course's structural hills, anticipating an advance up the roads. He stepped down into the lead swamp boat. The metal hull rang dully under his boots. "We bypassed the roads," Benton said. He reached down and engaged the electric motor. A faint hum vibrated through the water. The deputies boarded the boats, clutching their iron-sighted hunting rifles beneath their rubber ponchos. Benton checked the heavy red flare gun tucked into the poncho's chest pocket. One red burst would tell the other boats the overpass line had broken and mark the target through the rain. Benton took the tiller beside her and steered the metal craft into the flooded residential streets. The 3-foot surge submerged the sidewalks, fire hydrants, and mailboxes. The shallow hulls drew 4 inches of draft. They glided through the drowned neighborhood, their approach masked by the driving rain. Benton navigated by memory and the analog compass. He steered the boat over a sunken wooden picket fence, the metal hull scraping the post tops. They bypassed the fortified intersections where the Imperial soldiers shivered behind concrete barriers. The hostiles kept their weapons trained on the main avenues, focusing entirely on the main avenues. The local defenders piloted through the darkness, utilizing the catastrophic flooding as a frictionless highway to flank the invaders. The city's final substation succumbed to the wind and falling trees. A series of blue-green transformer explosions lit up the clouds as the remaining electrical grid collapsed. The outage erased every light source on the battlefield. The heavy cloud cover sealed away the moon and stars. The Imperial troops broke ranks in the dark. The rain washed out their thermal optics, and their night vision required ambient starlight. They huddled beneath the highway overpasses, the illuminated status rails on their armor pulsing through the gloom and marking their positions. A thunderclap from the eye wall's intense updrafts rattled the city's foundations, a concussive wave shaking the concrete. the troops' sensitive auditory organs, engineered for a thin atmosphere, overloaded. The soldiers dropped their weapons to clutch their skulls, their jaws clattering as the thunder echoed off the overpass pillars. Benton knelt in the bow of his swamp boat, holding position 50 yards away in the flooded ditch adjacent to the overpass. He tucked the lever-action rifle against his shoulder and tracked the glowing armor panels through the iron sights. He tracked the storm's rhythm. A jagged flash of sheet lightning illuminated the sky. He counted the seconds. He inhaled a steady breath and held it. 1, 2. The thunder cracked. Benton pulled the trigger. The thunder's roar swallowed the rifle's crack. The lead command node, an armored communications officer, jerked backwards and collapsed into the mud as the kinetic slug punched through his malfunctioning thermal shields. The surrounding soldiers scrambled, aiming their rifles into the darkness. The acoustic masking hid the boat's position. Benton worked the lever action, ejecting the spent brass casing onto the boat's floorboards. He sighted his next target. A glowing helmet visor. He scanned the sky for the next flash. Pacing his shots to the weather's rhythm, Benton utilized the thunder to cover the muzzle blast, dropping the command structure a single officer at a time. The storm reached its peak. A bolt of positive charged lightning arced down from the cloud deck, striking a metal utility pole 30 yards from Benton's boat. The strike showered the boat and the surrounding water in white-hot sparks. The concussive shockwave hit Benton in the chest, knocking him backward against the wooden bench. The lightning's crack, followed by the rushing sound of displaced water and falling debris, dragged Benton backward. His muscles locked. The present moment vanished. The smell of stagnant marsh mud replaced the rain. The storm's noise morphed into the roar of a crumbling earthen levee. The flooded city shifted into the neighboring parish's rising surge from 8 years ago. The memory of the trapped families pressed against his ribs. Black tide crested the rooftops in his mind. He held his breath, gripping the wooden stock of his rifle until knuckles popped. He stared into the darkness, locked into the breach's memory. From her seat at the tiller, Tess watched his posture stiffen. She recognized the stare. She dropped her emergency radio onto the floorboards. She lunged forward across the slick aluminium benches, grabbing the gunwale to stabilize herself. She dug her fingers firmly into the wet poncho on his shoulders. "Benton!" Tess shouted. He stared wide and fixed, anchored in the past. Tess shook his shoulder. She leaned in, forcing her face into his line of sight to block the lightning flashes. "Look at me!" she ordered, pitching her voice to a harsh, grounded register. "Benton, look at me!" He focused on her face, tracking the rain dripping from her hair. "The water stopped rising," Tess said, articulating every word. "The levees hold. You got them to the center. They sit safe on dry floors." She squeezed his shoulder tighter. "You stand in the present. We need the signal for the final push." Benton took a ragged breath. The old mud smell faded back to the rain-sharp scent. His chest unlocked. He blinked, bringing the flooded street back into focus. He looked at Tess. He nodded, working the stiffness from his jaw. "I'm here," Benton rasped. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, reached into his pocket, and extracted a heavy red flare gun. "Thank you." Tess offered a curt nod, released his shoulder, and picked up her radio. "Let's flush these stragglers." Aboard the flagship, Nemeth expanded his search parameters. With the thermal optical lasers scattered and the thermal imaging blinded by the rain, he scanned the lower bands to find any tactical data for his commander. He swept the analog radio frequencies bouncing around the planet's surface. His console chimed, locking onto a burst of unencrypted human chatter. The low-frequency analog band punched through the heavy atmospheric moisture. "Commander Soros," Nemeth announced. "Native communications intercepted, routing through the translation software." Soros leaned forward, parting her jaws. She listened for panicked military coordination, expecting the ragged voices of a broken command structure begging for reinforcements or organizing a surrender. The audio feed cracked over the command deck speakers, heavily laced with static, but translated by the ship's software. "Base, tell Jenkins to keep that backup generator running or I'm coming back to throw him in the canal." Tess spoke with a flat, gravelly exhaustion. Griggs replied with a slow drawl. "Base stands firm, Tess. Avenue runs clear on my end. The current washed the rest of them into the storm drains." "Copy that, Griggs," Benton answered, his tone steady. "Swamp boat flanks advance now. We drop to the command nodes. We push the stragglers toward the high school parking lot." Wind and rain filled the static-heavy silence. Griggs keyed the mic again. "Hey, Benton, you think the diner out on Highway 90 cooks breakfast after we mop up these guys? I need a plate of hash browns." "Depends on the wind shear, Griggs. Let's finish sweeping the intersection first. The transmission cut to static. Soros stood completely still. The native biologicals ignored the storm and the Imperial vanguard. They argued over electrical maintenance, utilized chemical cleaning agents as a weapon of disruption, and coordinated flanking maneuvers using crude watercraft. They debated breakfast logistics while slaughtering her elite forces. The audio confirmed a single tactical reality. The locals weaponized the catastrophic environment. The storm functioned as their shield and their spear. Soros turned away from the speakers. She stared at the holographic map dominating the deck center. The map updated based on Lemit's limited telemetry. It showed the entire Imperial invasion corridor consumed by the Cyclone's massive bands. Her surviving troops as flickering icons clustered together, hemmed in by deep water and hidden local hunters. The Imperial doctrine of overwhelming force fractured against the telemetry data. Her military conquered worlds by asserting technological dominance over predictable variables. Here, the atmosphere ripped that structure apart. The native species possessed the audacity to build their cities directly in the path of these localized apocalypses. She looked down at Nemet. The smaller adjutant trembled, his sensory baubles hanging slack against his jaw. These creatures lived inside their world's violence. They coexisted with the crushing pressure and the floods, utilizing the Death World weather against outsiders. Soros stepped closer to the storm-swirling projection. "You knew this was coming," she murmured, tracing the barometric pressure readouts. "You tracked this atmospheric anomaly, and you stayed." The tactical mindset defied her logic, anticipating destruction, calculating its exact trajectory, boarding up the windows and holding ground. That level of territoriality rendered the Imperial invasion moot. Soros initiated the final command protocol. The locals dismantled her technologically superior force. The tactical doctrines provided no defense against an enemy utilizing the sky as an accomplice. The mud, the water, and the shotguns would grind her elite vanguard into the sediment. She shelved the Imperial military protocols and bypassed the meritocracy's rules of engagement. Survival superseded pride. She stepped up to the primary communications console, shoving Nemet aside. "Override the encrypted command channels," Soros ordered. "The moisture blocks them. Route my voice through the analog, unencrypted local radio frequencies, broad spectrum, maximum output." Nemet keyed the commands, his claws clicking over the tactile interface. "Routing now, Commander." Soros leaned into the audio pickup. She dropped the formal cadence, raising her pitch to cut through the static. "All surviving Imperial units, this is Fleet Sub-Commander Soros. The operational theater presents lethal environmental hostility. Abandon all primary objectives. I override the invasion protocol. Retreat to the drop pods and launch immediately." The broadcast blasted across the static-laced radio bands, echoing through the olive-drab emergency radios in Tess's hands, and over the CB unit in Griggs's tow truck. In the flooded streets, the surviving soldiers heard the command. The organized retreat dictated by the manuals dissolved into a scramble for the extraction point. The troops ran through the thigh-deep water, dropping their waterlogged iron rifles and unlatching their heavy armor plating to cut weight. They splashed toward the eastern marshlands, their armor status lights strobing rapidly as they fled the local hunters in the crushing rain. The invasion collapsed into a rout. The remaining landers resting above the marsh mud fired their emergency extraction engines. They bypassed standard ascent protocols, executing an immediate vertical launch toward orbit. The scorched thrusters ignited, boiling the floodwaters beneath them into clouds of white vapor. Benton stood in the bow of his swamp boat near the city limits, watching the thrusters glow illuminate the dark marsh. He raised the heavy red flare gun, preparing to launch a phosphorus round to illuminate the retreating ships for a final volley from the deputies. He aimed the barrel toward the sky. Next, he lowered his arm. He let the flare gun rest against his thigh, watching the sky work. The fleeing landers punched upward, driving into the thick cloud cover. They hit the cyclone's eyewall updrafts. The wind shear caught the wide vessels. The kinetic energy's volume slammed into the hulls. The updrafts battered the heavy vessels off their vectors. The ships spun, their stabilizing thrusters firing late as they surrendered to the storm's fluid dynamics. Benton watched a gust throw a ship sideways. The hull tumbled before the pilot overcorrected the trajectory. They blasted through the stratosphere in a ragged retreat battered by the Earth's atmosphere. They arrived as conquerors and launched as scattered debris. Benton lowered his chin. He turned away from the sky and began the long wade back toward the community center. The hostiles fled, letting the storm finish its work. Hours later, the wind softened. The roar that consumed the city faded into a steady breeze. The morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting a warm light over the flooded landscape. Benton waded through the knee-deep water covering Main Street. His rubber poncho hung torn and stained with mud. His boots dragged across the submerged asphalt. Muscle fatigue burned in his calves and shoulders. He kept his shoulders back, pulling deep drafts of rain-washed air. The storm cleared the gunpowder and smoke, leaving the scent of wet pine and damp asphalt. He stepped over a submerged tree branch. Beside it lay the half-buried remnants of an Imperial ion rifle, its casing cracked, its inner workings packed solid with water and silt. The weapon lay inert in the daylight, an engineered tool dismantled by the local weather. He stepped past it, logging it as just another piece of debris to sweep up later. He looked down the avenue. The water receded, flowing at a crawl toward the drainage canals. The storm left a mark, power lines draped across the sidewalks. Wind-stripped shingles and splintered oak trees littered the lawns. The houses stood firm. The residents held their ground. Benton adjusted his grip on his analog compass, thumbing the solid brass. The community utilized their stubborn capacity to live in a place that regularly tried to drown them, turning that hostility into a shield. He pocketed the instrument and watched his neighbors emerge. Benton walked up the community center's concrete steps. The plywood over the windows bore deep scars from the flying debris, but the panels held firm. He pushed open the front door. Morning sunlight streamed through the open doorway, replacing the dead emergency lights. Tess and Griggs moved between the entry hall and the front porch, engaging in the quiet routine of recovery. Griggs pushed a wide broom across the porch, sweeping shattered glass and wet leaves away from the threshold. The bristle's rhythmic scritch-scratch echoed against the cinder blocks. Tess stood just inside near the folding table, wiping down the damp topographical maps with a rag. Griggs paused his sweeping as Benton walked in. The mechanic reached into his coveralls, extracted a crushed powdered sugar donut wrapped in a napkin, and handed it to Benton along with a dry cotton towel. "The highway dinner took a tree through the roof," Griggs drawled, leaning on the handle of his broom. "But the corner store generator runs fine." "Appreciate it, Briggs," Benton said. He took the towel, wiping the gritty mud from his face and neck. He bit into the crushed donut, chewing the sweet, starchy dough. Tess walked over, carrying a battery-powered radio. She set it on the table. She had tuned the dial away from the emergency frequencies, finding a static-laced jazz station broadcasting from a neighboring city. The notes of a saxophone filled the room, replacing the night's mechanical noise. They leaned against the porch railing, listening to the music. Outside, the neighborhood stirred. Residents wearing heavy boots and carrying chainsaws waded out of their homes. They kept their eyes on the fallen trees, nodding to each other and starting two-stroke engines to begin the work of clearing their city. Benton finished his donut, watching Griggs toss a piece of Imperial armor plating into a rusted dumpster. He glanced at Tess, who hummed along to the jazz radio while holding a fresh mug of coffee. They had outlasted the sky and the invaders, and now they went back to work.
Hello, my old members, subscribers, followers. I heard that my channel is low original, and I have submitted some videos in English to change the motto of my channel. Please subscribe my channel, view my videos, and share in all of your friends on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, every social media platform to send my video and view more videos. Viewer in my video, please help me to provide some time to spend with me. Thank you to all members who can subscribe my channel and support me some time. Please view more video and entertainment video. Please help me some time to support my channel, because I am a low middle class family. Please help me.